Picture this. You're standing on the sun-drenched coast of North Africa in the year 146 BC. The air, thick with the scent of salt and scorched earth, carries the distant, horrifying symphony of a city in its death throes. This isn't just any city. This is Carthage, the jewel of the Mediterranean, a sprawling metropolis of glittering temples and bustling markets, now reduced to a smouldering ruin. Roman legions, a relentless tide of bronze and iron, have been tearing it apart, stone by blood-soaked stone for 3 agonizing years. But what you're about to witness is something far more chilling than the chaos of war. It's an act of methodical, almost ritualistic annihilation, a calculated erasure of a people from the pages of history. As you watch Roman soldiers methodically sowing salt into the fields, a gesture of pure symbolic spite designed to poison the land for generations, you realize this isn't about conquest. This is about extermination. It's about ensuring that the very memory of Carthage, its culture, its gods, its people, would be nothing more than a ghost, a whisper on the wind. But why? What could this magnificent civilization have done to provoke such absolute, unrelenting hatred from the most powerful empire in the world? The answer lies not in the grand narratives of battles and treaties, but in the dark, whispered rumors that haunted Rome for centuries. Rumors of a monstrous god who demanded the ultimate sacrifice of children offered to the flames in an act of terrifying devotion. Before we descend into the shadows of this ancient rivalry and uncover the horrifying truth behind Rome's vendetta, if you find yourself captivated by the forgotten corners of history, take a moment to support our journey by hitting that like button and subscribing. Your curiosity fuels our exploration into these lost worlds. And please comment below and tell me where you're joining this journey from. It's a powerful reminder that history connects us all. A global community bound by a shared desire to understand our past. What you are about to hear is not just a story of war. It's the story of how propaganda can become history, how fear can justify genocide, and how the victors don't just write the history books, they burn the libraries of the vanquished. The story of Carthage's punishment is a chilling testament to the fact that the most effective weapon of war isn't the sword, but the story you tell about your enemy. Let's begin not with the flames of its destruction, but with the dawn of its glory. Long before Rome was anything more than a muddy backwater on the Tiber River, Carthage was a titan. Founded by the legendary Queen Dido, a refugee from the Phoenician city of Tyre, it was a city born from ingenuity and defiance. She was a figure of mythic proportions, a woman who outsmarted a local king by using a single ox hide to claim the land for her city. She had it cut into impossibly thin strips, long enough to encircle an entire hill, the future heart of her empire. This wasn't just a clever trick. It was the founding ethos of Carthage itself. They were a civilization of merchants and mariners, not warriors. Their power wasn't forged in the fires of conquest, but in the intricate web of trade routes that crisscrossed the known world. Their ships, the most advanced of their time, were masters of the sea, carrying precious cargoes of timber from Lebanon, silver from Spain, and tin from the far-off, mist-shrouded islands of Britain. Imagine the wealth that flowed through its harbors. Streets paved with the profits of a global enterprise, a cosmopolitan hub where dozens of languages mingled in the marketplace. While Romans were still living in huts, Carthaginians were engineering complex sanitation systems, building multi-story apartment buildings, and creating a constitution so sophisticated that the great philosopher Aristotle himself would later praise it as one of the finest in the world. This was a republic, governed by a senate of merchant princes, where power was earned through commercial acumen, not inherited by bloodline. They were pragmatists, innovators, the world's first true capitalists. But this very success, this glittering empire built on commerce rather than conquest, was a source of deep suspicion and envy for the burgeoning power across the sea. Rome saw the world through the eyes of a soldier. For them, wealth was something to be taken, land something to be conquered. The Carthaginian mindset, The idea that you could control the world through contracts and currency instead of legions and legions was alien, unsettling, and ultimately threatening. They looked at Carthage's colossal harbour, a marvel of engineering, with its circular design and capacity for over 200 warships. And they didn't see a gateway for commerce. They saw a dagger pointed at the heart of Italy. This fundamental clash of ideologies, the farmer-soldier versus the merchant-sailor, was the fault line upon which the ancient world would crack. The Romans, with their rigid social hierarchy and obsession with military glory, viewed the Carthaginians as greedy, effeminate, and untrustworthy. They called them Punic, a term derived from Phoenician, but it was spat like an insult, dripping with connotations of deceit and cowardice. Roman historians would later paint them as a people pathologically faithless, coining the term Punic faith to mean treachery. This was the seed of the propaganda war that would eventually justify their annihilation. The First Clash. The First Punic War was an accidental epic, a bloody 23-year struggle for control of the island of Sicily. It was a brutal learning curve for both sides. Rome, a land-based power, had to build a navy from scratch, famously reverse engineering a captured Carthaginian vessel. They suffered catastrophic losses, entire fleets wiped out by storms and superior Punic seamanship. But they possessed a grim, unyielding tenacity that Carthage, with its reliance on mercenaries, simply couldn't match. For Rome, war was a total, societal commitment. For Carthage, it was a grim entry on a balance sheet, a costly disruption to business. In the end, Rome's stubborn refusal to quit, their willingness to absorb staggering casualties, won them the day. Carthage was humbled, forced to pay a crippling indemnity and surrender Sicily. But this defeat didn't break them. It taught them a valuable, dangerous lesson. It taught them that to deal with Rome, the language of commerce was not enough. You had to speak the A language of the sword. And it was in the wake of this humiliation that a new figure would emerge from the heart of Carthage's most powerful family, a man who would embody this new, terrifying realization. His name was Hamilcar Barca, and as he stood before the altars of his city, he forced his 9-year-old son to place his hand on the sacrificial animal and swear a sacred, blood-soaked oath, an oath of eternal, undying hatred for Rome. That boy's name was Hannibal, and the oath he swore that day would set the world on fire. It was a promise that would lead him and his elephants over the frozen Alps in one of the most audacious military maneuvers in all of history. A promise that would bring the Roman Republic to the very brink of utter collapse. The seeds of Carthage's destruction were sown not in its final fiery moments, but in this solemn promise made by a child, a vow that would transform a rivalry of commerce into a blood feud for the very soul of the ancient world. The Romans would never forget the terror Hannibal unleashed upon them, the years of living in fear as he rampaged through their homeland. And that fear would fester, turning into a cold, genocidal rage that could only be satisfied by the complete and utter eradication of the city that had dared to challenge their destiny. That oath, sworn by a child in the flickering lamplight of a sacrificial chamber, was not an empty promise. It became the defining principle of Hannibal Barca's existence. It was forged into his very soul, shaping him from a boy of privilege into a living instrument of Carthaginian vengeance. You have to understand, Hannibal wasn't just a general. He was the culmination of a generation of simmering rage. While Rome grew complacent, fat on the spoils of its first victory, the Barca family was quietly, methodically building a new empire far from the watchful eyes of the Senate. In the rugged landscapes of Spain, they found what Carthage had lost: wealth, power, and a new source of soldiers. Hamilcar, and after his death, his son-in-law Hasdrubal, transformed the Iberian Peninsula into a personal fiefdom, a Barca dominion. They weren't just colonizing, they were assimilating. They built a new capital, which they called New Carthage, a defiant name if there ever was one, and tapped into the legendary silver mines that funded their entire enterprise. But more importantly, they found men. The fierce Celtiberian tribes of Spain were some of the most formidable warriors in the ancient world. loyal to the death if you could earn their respect. And Hannibal, who grew up among them, learned their languages and fought alongside them in countless skirmishes, earned that respect in blood and sweat. When he took command at the age of 26, he inherited not just an army, but a cult of personality. His soldiers weren't the paid mercenaries of the old Carthage. They were men who would follow him anywhere, who believed in him with a religious fervor. They saw a commander who shared their hardships, who slept on the ground wrapped in a soldier's cloak, who was always the first to charge and the last to retreat. He was a strategic genius who could think 10 moves ahead of his opponents, a master of logistics, and above all, a student of his enemy. He knew the Roman psyche, their arrogance, their predictability, their reliance on brute force and textbook maneuvers, and he planned to use it all against them. The flashpoint came at the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally on the Spanish coast. By attacking it, Hannibal was deliberately throwing a lit torch into a powder keg. He was daring Rome to act. The siege was brutal, an 8-month-long grind that showcased Hannibal's tactical brilliance and his utter ruthlessness. When the city finally fell, Rome was outraged. They sent ambassadors to Carthage, their spokesman dramatically holding a fold in his toga. "Here," he declared, "we bring you peace and war. Choose which you will." The Carthaginian Senate, emboldened by Hannibal's success and swept up in the tide of his ambition, roared back, "You choose!" When the Roman dropped, the fold signifying war, they accepted it with a cheer, oblivious to the abyss they were about to leap into, because Hannibal had no intention of fighting a defensive war. He wasn't going to wait for the Roman legions to land in Spain or Africa. He was going to do the one thing the Romans believed to be absolutely, physically impossible. He was going to take the war to them, marching his army into the heart of Italy itself. When he revealed his plan to his commanders, they must have thought he was insane. His plan wasn't to sail across the sea, a journey Rome's now superior navy would easily intercept. No, he was going to march north, out of Spain, across the Pyrenees Mountains, through the hostile lands of southern Gaul, across the mighty Rhone River, and then, in an act of breathtaking audacity, he would take his army of 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 3 dozen war elephants over the frozen, sky-piercing peaks of the Alps. This was not a military strategy. It was a madness born of genius. The Alps were not a logistical challenge. They were a wall, a natural fortress that had guarded Italy since the dawn of time. No army of this size had ever even contemplated such a crossing. The Romans didn't even bother to guard the northern passes, because the very idea was laughable. It was the strategic equivalent of invading a castle by climbing the sheer face of its highest tower during a blizzard. The journey began as a testament to his will. He smashed through hostile Gallic tribes, bribed others, and outmaneuvered Roman forces sent to stop him in southern Gaul. At the Rhone River, he faced his first great obstacle. The elephants, terrified of the water, refused to cross. Any other general might have abandoned them. Hannibal, however, built massive, earth-covered rafts, disguised to look like extensions of the land, and tricked the colossal beasts into walking onto them before they were floated across the raging river. It was a glimmer of the unconventional genius he would soon unleash upon Italy. But the Rhone was merely a prelude. As the first snows of late autumn began to fall, his army stood at the foot of the Alps. What lay before them was a nightmarish landscape of vertical rock, razor-thin paths, and plunging chasms. For 15 days, his army was trapped in a frozen hell. They were relentlessly harried by mountain tribes who would roll boulders down on them from the cliffs above. The paths, already treacherous, became coated in ice. Men and pack animals slipped, their screams echoing as they vanished into the abyss. The elephants, ill-suited to the cold and the altitude, suffered terribly. Their mournful cries, a constant reminder of the alien environment they had been forced into. The cold was a relentless enemy, claiming more lives than any human foe. Supplies dwindled, starvation set in, morale plummeted. This was the true test of Hannibal's leadership. He was everywhere, rallying his men, sharing their misery, pointing south towards the distant hazy plains of Italy and promising them the riches of Rome. When they finally descended, stumbling out of the mountains like ghosts, his army was a wreck. He had lost almost half his men and most of his precious elephants. He was now in enemy territory, cut off from any hope of reinforcement, with a battered, exhausted, and half-frozen force. And standing between him and his oath of vengeance was the full, undivided military might of the Roman Republic. The greatest gamble in military history had succeeded. But the war, the real war, had only just begun. The Roman Republic, in its towering arrogance, saw Hannibal's arrival not as a mortal threat, but as a welcome opportunity. Here was the upstart Carthaginian, delivered to their doorstep, his army ravaged by the mountains. It was a chance to crush him quickly, to end this ridiculous war before it had truly begun. The Senate dispatched 2 consular armies, each a formidable force of Roman heavy infantry, confident that their legions, the unstoppable engines of their expansion, would make short work of Hannibal's exhausted and disparate collection of Spanish mercenaries and Numidian horsemen. They had no concept of the man they were about to face. They had never encountered a mind like his, a mind that saw the battlefield not as a grid for textbook formations, but as a 3-dimensional canvas for deception, ambush, and psychological warfare. The first major clash came at the Trebia River, a shallow, freezing waterway in northern Italy. The Roman commander, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was a man carved from the very rock of Roman tradition. Brave, aggressive, and utterly predictable. Hannibal knew this. He had studied him. He knew Sempronius was itching for a glorious victory to advance his political career. And so, Hannibal laid a trap, not of ropes and nets, but of human psychology. On a bitterly cold December morning, he sent his light Numidian cavalry across the river to harass the Roman camp, to taunt them, to wound their pride. Sempronius, as Hannibal knew he would, took the bait. Enraged, he ordered his entire army to give chase, forgoing breakfast, forgoing proper preparation, plunging them through the chest-deep, ice-cold water of the Trebia. As the Romans emerged on the other side, shivering, soaked, and hungry, they found Hannibal's army waiting for them, well-fed, dry, and arranged in perfect battle formation. The Romans, driven by sheer discipline, still managed to hold their own in the center. But it was a battle fought on Hannibal's terms, and he had one more surprise in store. Hidden in a covered ditch on the Roman flank, Hannibal had placed his brother, Mago, with 2,000 of his best men, a force the Romans had no idea existed. At the crucial moment, as the battle raged, Mago's force erupted from their hiding place and slammed into the rear of the Roman legions. The effect was devastating. What had been a battle became a slaughter. The Roman army, attacked from the front, the flanks, and now the rear, simply disintegrated. Tens of thousands were cut down. The survivors fled in a desperate rout. The Battle of the Trebia was more than a victory, it was a statement. Hannibal had announced his arrival in Italy not just with a win, but with the utter humiliation and annihilation of a consular army. The shock in Rome was profound. This was not supposed to happen. But shock quickly gave way to renewed determination. They raised new legions, appointed new consuls, and prepared to meet the threat head-on. The new commander, Gaius Flaminius, was another classic Roman archetype, a populist politician, contemptuous of the old aristocracy and desperate to prove himself with a swift, decisive victory. He pursued Hannibal south, eager to pin him down and force a battle. Hannibal, now moving through the marshy, disease-ridden lands of Etruria, seemed to be retreating. Flaminius saw this as a sign of weakness, of fear. He didn't realize he was being led, step by step, into one of the most perfectly conceived and brutally executed ambushes in the history of warfare. Hannibal had found his killing ground at Lake Trasimene, a large lake surrounded by hills, with a narrow defile running along its northern shore. It was a natural trap. He marched his army through the defile, And then, under the cover of a thick morning mist, he concealed his entire force in the wooded hillsides overlooking the path. As dawn broke, Flaminius, blind and deaf in the fog, led his army in a long, marching column straight into the jaws of the trap. The Roman column stretched for miles along the narrow path, their flank completely exposed, trapped between the lake on one side and the hills on the other. They had no idea they were marching into their own grave. Once the last Roman soldier had entered the defile, Hannibal gave the signal. From the hills above, his army descended like an avalanche. The Gallic infantry slammed into the Roman flank. The Spanish heavy infantry sealed the exit, and the Numidian cavalry closed the entrance, cutting off any hope of retreat. The Romans, caught completely by surprise, still in marching formation, had no chance to form a proper battle line. They were butchered where they stood. The mist that had concealed the ambush was now thick with the screams of dying men. The waters of the lake turned red with blood as thousands were driven into it and drowned under the weight of their own armor. The slaughter was absolute. In the space of 3 hours, an entire Roman army, including its consul, Gaius Flaminius, was wiped from the face of the earth. 15,000 Romans were killed, another 15,000 captured. Hannibal lost only 1,500 men. The news of Trasimene hit Rome like a physical blow. The city was gripped by a panic it hadn't known for centuries. This wasn't just a defeat, it was an existential crisis. Hannibal was no longer a distant threat. He was a spectre of destruction, seemingly invincible, moving freely through their homeland. The Senate, in its desperation, turned to one man, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was the complete opposite of the rash commanders Hannibal had, just destroyed. He was old, cautious, and deeply unpopular. He was given the powers of a dictator and tasked with a single grim objective: save the Republic. And Fabius understood a fundamental truth that his predecessors had not. You could not beat Hannibal in a pitched battle. He was simply too good. To attack him was to play his game. So Fabius created a new strategy, one that was deeply, profoundly un-Roman. He would not fight. He would shadow Hannibal's army, harass his supply lines, cut off his foragers, and bleed him slowly, a death. By 1,000 cuts, he would refuse to give Hannibal the decisive battle he craved. This strategy, which would earn him the mocking nickname the Delayer, was brilliant. It was the only way to win. But for the Roman people, who craved victory and vengeance, it was seen as nothing short of cowardice. The pressure began to build, a popular clamour for a return to true Roman values, for a decisive confrontation that would crush the invader once and for all. And that pressure would lead them to their darkest day, to a field in southern Italy called Cannae, where the Roman Republic would learn the true cost of its pride in a cataclysm of blood and steel that would echo for eternity. The Fabian strategy was a masterpiece of military pragmatism, but it was a political disaster. Rome was not a nation that understood patience. It was a civilization built on the foundation of the decisive victory, of the glorious, head-on collision, of legions that always resulted in Roman triumph. Fabius's tactics, his constant retreating and skirmishing, were anathema to the Roman soul. To them, it felt like a coward's game. The fields of Italy were burning, their allies were defecting to Hannibal's side, and their great dictator was refusing to fight. The frustration in the city festered into a toxic political brew. The popular assembly, led by rabble-rousing tribunes, openly mocked Fabius, calling him Hannibal's pedagogus, the slave who followed a schoolboy around, carrying his books but never intervening. The pressure became unbearable. Rome didn't just want a victory, it needed one to restore its pride and reassert the natural order of the world. And so, when Fabius's term as dictator expired, the Senate, bowing to the will of the enraged populace, made a fateful decision. They would abandon this cowardly strategy of delay. They would raise the largest army in the history of the Republic, a colossal force of 8 full legions, numbering close to 90,000 men. They would march south, find Hannibal, and erase him from the earth through the sheer, overwhelming mathematics of brute force. Command of this grand army was given to two newly elected consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, and in them, the two warring spirits of Rome were made flesh. Paulus was an aristocrat, an experienced soldier from an old patrician family. He was cautious, pragmatic, and had a healthy, terrified respect for Hannibal's genius. He was, in essence, a disciple of Fabius. Varro, on the other hand, was a populist, a butcher's son, who had risen through the ranks on a wave of popular anger. He was arrogant, impetuous, and he openly promised the people the one thing they craved: a swift, brutal, and glorious battle. He saw Paulus's caution as the very poison that had weakened Rome. The Roman system of command, where the two consuls held authority on alternating days, was a disaster waiting to happen. As this monstrous army, the ultimate expression of Roman power, rumbled south, Hannibal watched. His army was outnumbered almost 2-1, a ragged collection of Gauls, Spaniards, and Africans, held together only by their fanatical devotion to him. He knew he could not outfight this force. He had to outthink it, and so he retreated, pulling the Romans deeper into southern Italy until he found the perfect place for the masterpiece he was about to conduct. He chose the plains near the small supply depot of Cannae. It was a flat, open, featureless landscape, seemingly terrible ground for an outnumbered army. But Hannibal saw what the Romans did not. He saw a canvas for his cavalry. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, the sun rose hot and unforgiving. It was Varro's day to command. He looked out across the plain at Hannibal's smaller army and saw the victory he had promised, the glory that would make him a legend. He ignored the grave warnings of his co-consul Paulus, who begged him not to fight on such open ground. Varro's mind was made up. He gave the order to form for battle. The Romans did exactly what Hannibal expected. Confident in their superior numbers, they deployed their legions in a formation of unprecedented depth and density. Their plan was simple, Roman, in its brutal logic. They would use their infantry as a massive battering ram, a human tidal wave, that would punch through the Carthaginian center and shatter their army. It was a plan devoid of subtlety, built on the arrogant certainty that might, and might alone, made right. Across the field, Hannibal arranged his own men in a formation that must have looked like madness to the Romans. In his center, he placed his weakest troops, the unreliable Spanish and Gallic infantry. He pushed them forward in a thin convex crescent, a bulging arc that bowed out towards the charging Romans. On his flanks, set back from the center, he stationed his elite, battle-hardened African infantry, armed with captured Roman weapons and armor. And on the wings, he placed his greatest advantage, his magnificent cavalry, the heavy Spanish and Gallic horsemen on his left, and the swift, superb Numidian light cavalry on his right. As the horns blew, the battle began. The great Roman battering ram surged forward, thousands upon thousands of men, a forest of shields and spears crashing into Hannibal's thin crescent. The Gauls and Spaniards in the center groaned under the impact, but they did not break. As Hannibal himself rode among them, urging them to hold, they began a slow, deliberate fighting withdrawal. The Roman legions, sensing the enemy was collapsing, roared in triumph and pushed harder, driving deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian line. The crescent began to invert, bending inwards, pulling the Romans forward, ever forward, into the heart of the formation. Varro, watching from the rear, must have thought he was winning a glorious textbook victory. He was, in fact, marching his entire army into a perfectly designed kill box. While the Roman infantry was being sucked into this central vortex, the real battle was being decided on the wings. Hannibal's superior cavalry, led by his brilliant commander Hasdrubal, slammed into the weaker Roman horse and obliterated them. It wasn't even a contest. The Roman cavalry was swept from the field, and now the trap began to close. As the Roman legions pushed to the furthest point of the inverted crescent, Hannibal's elite African infantry, who had been held in reserve on the flanks, pivoted inward. They slammed into the exposed sides of the now disorganized Roman column. In a matter of minutes, the Roman army, which had been on the attack, was now being attacked from 3 sides. But the masterpiece was not yet complete. Hasdrubal, having destroyed the Roman cavalry, did not give chase. Instead, he led his horsemen in a wide, galloping arc around the entire back of the battlefield and smashed into the rear of the Roman legions. The encirclement was complete. The mightiest army the Republic had ever fielded was now trapped, surrounded on all sides, packed into a space so tight they could not even properly swing their swords. What followed was not a battle. It was a methodical, industrial process of killing that lasted for 8 horrific hours. It was a symphony of slaughter, conducted by a master. The legionaries, the pride of Rome, died in their tens of thousands, suffocated by the press of their own men, trampled underfoot, or cut down by enemies they couldn't even see. The consul Paulus died in the chaos, fighting to the last. Varro, the architect of the disaster, disgracefully fled. When the sun finally set on the blood-soaked plain of Cannae, as many as 70,000 Roman and Allied soldiers lay dead or dying. It remains to this day one of the single deadliest days of combat in human history. Hannibal had lost less than 6,000 men. He had achieved the impossible. He had not just defeated the Roman army, he had annihilated it. The road to Rome was open. The city was defenseless. The Republic was on its knees, bleeding and broken, waiting for the final blow. The news of Cannae arrived in Rome not as a report, but as a shockwave of pure, undiluted terror. The city fell into a collective state of panic and despair, unlike anything it had ever known. When the first few bedraggled survivors began to trickle in, their stories were so horrific, so unbelievable, that they seemed like the ravings of madmen. But as more and more came, their accounts confirmed the ghastly truth. The army was gone. The consuls were dead or missing. The very shield of the Republic had been shattered. The historian Livy describes a city consumed by a public grief so profound that all business ceased. The streets echoed with the wails of women mourning husbands, sons, and brothers. The Senate, for the first time in its history, had to post guards at the city gates to physically prevent terrified citizens from fleeing in a mass exodus. They were trapped, convinced that Hannibal's legions would be appearing over the hills at any moment. Maharbal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, famously rode up to him after the battle, intoxicated by the scale of their victory. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal," he urged, "but you do not know how to use one. Ride with me now, and in 5 days you will be dining on the Capitoline Hill." He was begging Hannibal to march on Rome itself. The city was defenseless, its morale utterly broken. It was the moment the entire campaign had been building towards, the final, decisive blow. And yet, Hannibal hesitated. He said no. This decision, the decision not to march on Rome, has been debated by historians for over 2 millennia. Why did he stop? The truth is a complex mixture of logistical reality and strategic calculation. His army, though victorious, was exhausted and had suffered its own losses. He lacked the heavy siege equipment necessary to breach Rome's formidable walls. An immediate assault would have been a bloody, costly gamble. Perhaps more importantly, Hannibal's ultimate goal may never have been the complete destruction of Rome. He was a Carthaginian, a product of a commercial empire. His objective was likely to break the back of the Roman military, to shatter their confederation of Italian allies, and to force a punitive peace treaty that would reduce Rome to a second-rate power, leaving Carthage as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. He believed that the sheer scale of the Cannae disaster would be enough. He thought the Italian cities, bound to Rome by treaty, would see that their master was a paper tiger and flock to his side. And for a time, it seemed he was right. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, defected. So did many of the southern Greek cities. His strategy of dissolving the Roman alliance seemed to be working, but Hannibal had made a fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the single most powerful weapon in the Roman arsenal: their indomitable, stubborn, almost insane refusal to ever admit defeat. While Hannibal was consolidating his position in southern Italy, something extraordinary was happening in Rome. The city, having stared into the abyss, did not collapse. It pulled itself back from the brink with a display of collective will that is almost unparalleled in history. The old man they had mocked, Quintus Fabius Maximus, was recalled to power. He, along with a new generation of leaders, imposed a brutal, iron discipline on the city. Public mourning was officially limited. New legions were raised by any means necessary. They armed slaves, offering them freedom in exchange for service. They emptied the prisons. They lowered the property qualification for military service to nothing, enrolling the urban poor. They even took down the ancestral weapons displayed as trophies in the temples to arm the new recruits. They refused to even receive Hannibal's envoy, who had come to discuss the ransoming of the thousands of Roman prisoners taken at Cannae. The message was clear, sent not just to Hannibal, but to the world. Rome does not negotiate. Rome does not surrender, ever. This was the turning point of the war. Not a battle, but an act of collective, defiant will. Rome shifted back to the Fabian strategy, but this time with a vengeance. They would never again face Hannibal in a pitched battle in Italy. They would contain him, starve him. And while he was trapped in the south, a prisoner of his own success, they would take the war everywhere else. And it was here that a new Roman hero emerged, a man who was Hannibal's equal in strategic genius, but who possessed a political cunning and a ruthlessness that even the Carthaginian could not match. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio was a survivor of Cannae. He had witnessed the horror firsthand, and it had taught him a vital lesson. To defeat Hannibal, you had to become like him. You had to be audacious, unpredictable, and willing to break the rules. While the old guard in the Senate focused on merely surviving in Italy, Scipio argued for a radical new strategy: attack the source of Hannibal's power. He convinced the Senate to give him command of the Roman forces in Spain, the Barca family's personal empire, the wellspring of their silver and their manpower. What Scipio did in Spain was nothing short of miraculous. He used Hannibal's own tactics of speed, surprise, and psychological warfare against the Carthaginian generals there. He captured their capital, New Carthage, in a stunning surprise assault, and through a combination of brilliant battlefield victories and shrewd diplomacy, he systematically dismantled their entire Spanish dominion. He had severed Hannibal's lifeline. Trapped in Italy for over a decade, Hannibal watched as the war turned against him. His brother, Hasdrubal, attempting to march from Spain to Italy with reinforcements in a repeat of Hannibal's own Alpine crossing, was intercepted and defeated. His severed head was unceremoniously thrown into Hannibal's camp, a ghastly message from Rome. The tide had irrevocably turned. Finally, Scipio, now the undisputed hero of the Republic, proposed the endgame. He would do what Hannibal had done. He would take the war to the enemy's homeland. He would invade Africa and force Carthage to recall its greatest champion to defend the city itself. The final act of this epic struggle was about to be staged, not on the fields of Italy, but on the dusty plains just a few miles from the glittering walls of Carthage. The two greatest generals of the age, Hannibal and Scipio, were finally going to meet face to face.